All right, gang, so this is going to be part 2 of our 3 classes on chapter 7. So today, on Tuesday, we left off starting to do our first estimate, which was cost to charge ratio. So I'll review that real quick. So this is the example, and I took this straight out of the book, so you can double check, look at the numbers in the book if you'd like. So we have a clinic, or we have a service maybe that has 2 clinics in it, an audiology clinic and an ENT clinic, right? And the audiology clinic is run by a master's level trained audiologist. The ENT is a surgeon, and they do different stuff. Now, in this example, we're allowing both clinics to have 5,000 visits for a total of 10,000 visits. And then the difference is audiology is less intensive than ENT, so it earns fewer RVUs per visit. Now, I don't know how the book came up with these RVU numbers. They're kind of crazy numbers. So we'll just run with that. But don't go around thinking that an audiologist ever does anything that generates 10 RVUs. And an ENT would be pretty hard put to do something that's 18 RVUs, certainly in an office setting. Okay, but setting the unreality of the RVUs aside, let's keep going. And then we have so this is their production levels, and then we have their annual direct costs and their annual overhead. So the direct cost to the audiology clinic is $242. For ENT, it's $485. And for the total combined audiology and ENT, it's $727 for direct, which we get by adding the $242 and the $485. There's also a $300,000 overhead charge. A portion of that could be coming from the organization. So maybe the hospital is stepping some of that down to them. It could also be that the combined 2 clinics share maybe some nursing staff or PSR, so front desk staff, or maybe there's a office manager that provides services to both the audiology and ENT clinics. Regardless of the source, there's $300,000 worth of overhead that have to be shared out between the 2 entities. Then we said, okay, we have, so we don't know what the total cost of running audiology is just yet, and we don't know what the cost of running ENT is just yet. But we do know how much they charge. And the reason we don't know that is because we don't know how much of the 300,000 should be allocated to audiology and how much of it should be allocated to ENT. So that's what we're going to figure out using the cost to charge ratio. So the first line here are the actual charges based on, say, the charge master. So their charges from coming out of audiology were 700,000, charges coming out of ENT were 1.4 million. Add those 2 together, and the combined operation bills out 2.1 million. Now, what we talked about in class on Tuesday was, we know from chapter 3 of the textbook that healthcare organizations charge a lot more than they actually expect to collect, mainly because of contractual allowances, which means they've got contractual arrangements with insurance companies that say that they're going to charge less, that the insurance companies are going to pay them some fraction of the actual charged amount. And then finally, the annual revenue is what they actually collect from the insurance companies. And so here you can see there's about a 40%, maybe more, amount taken off as a result of the allowances for the contracts. Okay, so 400,000 plus 900,000 gives us 1.3 million in total revenue for the overall clinic. So the first thing we did was we said, all right, we're going to do the cost to charge ratio, which is simply we're going to use the ratio of charges to allocate the 300,000. So our goal is to allocate this 300,000, right? So we're going to use our 4-step method. Step 1, cost pool. The cost pool is the overhead. So that's 300,000. That needs to be allocated. Step 2 is the cost driver. And the cost driver is, we're saying, is annual charges. So we always take, remember from the prior chapter from 6, we take, when we're calculating the cost driver, we're going to take the total for the organization. So the total for the organization in this case is $2.1 million. The allocation rate is the cost pool divided by the cost driver. So cost pool divided by cost driver is, I'm just going to lop off some zeros, 300 divided by 2100, which gives us, let me look at my notes, approximately 0.143 in overhead per dollar charge. So that's our driver. Then we do the allocation amount. Right, so we're doing the same 4-step process. The allocation amount is the cost driver, or the allocation rate, right? The allocation rate times the cost driver for the individual clinic. So in this case, it's going to be 0.143 times for the audiology clinic, 700,000. So 0.143 times 700,000 gives us 100,000, and 0.143 times 1.4 million for ENT gives us 200,000. And if you total that up, it's 300,000. So we're allocating, right, which is equal to our cost pool of 300,000, right? So we know that we've allocated this appropriately. So now what would we do? Well, in class, what I did was I said, okay, I'm going to take 100,000. I don't know if you can see that. I'm using pencil because I'm going to erase it as my overhead. And I'm going to add that to the annual direct costs to get my total cost for audiology, which would be $342,500. And then for my ENT, I'm going to allocate them 200,000. So I'm adding 200. So 485 plus 200 is 685. Right. Add those two together, and they should add up to the 1,027,000 again. Okay, so that was what we did in class on Tuesday. So that was just a little bit of a repeat. Let me get rid of these numbers for now. I'll write over them later. So that was cost to charge ratio again. That's what we did in class. Now we're going to do a variation on this. It's the same principle. We're going to use the same 4-step ratio. Actually, I want to do something else first before I do the RVU method. I want to do revenues. I want to use revenues instead of charges. So the book kind of talks about cost to charge ratio, but really what we're doing is a technique. And the technique works based on whichever driver you want to choose. So this time, instead of choosing annual charges, which, as we know, are basically funny money, we're going to use annual revenue. Why might you use revenue instead of charges? Well, annual charges aren't connected to, only loosely connected to reality, whereas annual revenues are really what we collected. So if you're going to pick between annual charges and annual revenue, it's better to choose annual revenue because annual revenue is tied to something real, whereas annual charges is just some numbers that were made up in the finance department. So now we're going to use annual revenues. So we're going to take the same approach. Step 1, cost pool. Well, the cost pool is still 300,000. Nothing's changed. Right. Step 2, cost driver. The cost driver in this case now what we used before was annual charges, and so we took the total annual charges. We're going to use annual revenues instead, so we're just going to take the total annual revenues, which is 1.3 million. Step 3, the allocation rate, which is equal to the cost pool divided by the cost driver. So 300 divided by 1.3 million gives us about 2308. Now notice something. I'm working with cents here, right? This is a really small number. So if you round to the like 23 cents or worse, you round to 20 cents, you're going to get way off. So when you're dealing with like your number is some number of cents, it's a good idea to go out to at least the, what is this, 10,000th place, right? So go out 4 digits. That's the 10,000th place. All right. So that's our allocation rate. It's 23.808 cents per dollar of revenue. So now we calculate the allocation for based on revenues rather than on charges. So for audiology, the allocation amount is going to equal 0.2308 times their audiology's annual revenue, which is 400,000. And that gives us about 92,308. And then ENT, same thing, 0.2308 times, instead of 400,000, we're going to use 900,000. And we get 207,692. If we add those two together, we're going to get 300,000 again, which yay adds up to here. So now we would take that and we would write it in here. And we'd say, okay, 92,308. And here, 207,692. Now what's happened? Well, under the charges, the cost to charge ratio, audiology got 100,000 in charges and ENT got $200,000 in charges. So under the annual revenue, using annual revenue for your allocation cost driver, more money is being shifted to ENT, more cost, I should say. More cost is being shifted to ENT. So the overhead that's being allocated to audiology goes down and the overhead allocated to ENT goes up to the tune of about $7,000 is shifted from audiology over to ENT. And that gives us new totals of 334, 808, and 692, 692. Okay, so that's so that is a variation, right, on the cost to charge. Instead of using charges, I used revenues, and it was really the same approach, right? We used the 4-step approach. We just changed up, well, what's the driver going to be? Well, in this case, the driver is going to be total revenues instead of total charges. So we just switched. Right? There's nothing magical about using charges as opposed to revenues, other than revenues are probably better, actually. Okay, so we just switched, used 1.3 million. Then we just did the same stuff as we did before. Take the cost pool divided by the cost driver, that's 300 divided by 1,300, gave us the allocation rate of 0.2308, multiply 0.2308 times the now instead of the overall driver, we're going to use the driver for the activity, right, which in this case is audiology, 400,000, right, and ENT, 900,000. All right, so there's that. Now, The next variation we can do, it's very similar, but you have to watch yourself a little bit. And this is to use the RVU method. So the RVU method, very similar, but we're going to use, instead of charges, we're going to use RVUs. Now, you can't just use 10 RVUs and 18 RVUs. Well, you could in this case, yeah, kind of, but if these numbers were different, it wouldn't work out. So what we first need to do is calculate the total number of RVUs for each clinic. So audiology, total RVUs is going to be 5,000 visits times 10 RVUs per visit gives me 50,000 RVUs. And ENT is got 5,000 visits times 18 RVUs per visit is going to give me 90,000 RVUs. Okay, well, if we add that together, that's 140,000 RVUs, right? Which is now the total RVUs for the combined hearing department, or whatever we want to call this, right? So the overall is 140. So just like we used before, the total annual charges or the total annual revenues, we're going to use the total RVUs as our cost driver. So now we can do our 4-step method again. Step 1, cost pool, right? Cost pool is still 300,000. Step 2, cost driver. Cost driver is going to be total annual RVUs, that's 140. Right. Allocation rate is 300 divided by 140. I'm just lopping off the zeros, right? Because the ratio stays the same. Right. So 300 divided by 140 gives me about 2.1429 dollars per RVU. So now I'm going to calculate the allocation amount for audiology. And so this is exactly the same, 2.1429, is that right? Did I write that right? Yeah, 29 times the number of RVUs for audiology, which is 50,000. So 50,000 times 2.1429 is 107,143. And then for ENT, it's 2.1429 times 90,000 RVUs, which is 192,857. And if we add these together, it comes out to 300,000, which, yay, matches up to our, that's a 2. That matches up to our initial cost pool, so we know we've allocated. So this time, more is being allocated to audiology than is to ENT, right? So the first time it was 100 and 200. Then when we did, that was for cost to charge. Then when we did based on annual revenue, the opposite thing happened. Audiology got stuck with about $92,000 in overhead, and ENT got stuck with 207,000 roughly in overhead. Now, when we use RVUs, the kind of opposite thing happens, and audiology winds up getting 107,000, and ENT gets 192. So under, so audiology would like us to use annual revenue, because in that case they only get 92,000 in overhead. Under charges they get 100,000, and under RVUs they get 107,000. ENT, on the other hand, would prefer that you get we use RVUs because that's the lowest they get. They prefer charges versus revenues because with charges they got 200,000, but with revenues they got 207,000. So that's kind of entertaining, right? So just to rough that out real quick. So you got ENT and audiology, and we have that's messy. Audiology, ENT, right? And we had cost to charge, cost to charge, C to C, right? Cost to revenue, C to R, right? And then RVU, right? And so under cost to charge, audiology got 100, ENT got 200. Under cost to revenue, audiology got 92, right? These are very rough numbers. And let's say 93. And ENT got 207, right? So that they still add up to 300. I'm having to round here. And then under RVU, audiology gets 107 and some change, and ENT, let's say, gets 193. Again, I'm rounding, so we get 300. So in all three of these examples, we have the same overhead, right? It's 300, 300, 300. So nothing's changing there. All we're doing is using a different, slightly different cost driver to allocate the overhead. So the choice. So my point is, the choice of driver doesn't change how much overhead has to be allocated overall, but the cost of driver does have a direct impact on how the overhead is actually ultimately distributed, right? So under charges, right, that was our baseline case. We get 100 and 200. Under, if we use revenues, cost to revenue as opposed to cost to charges, audiology does a little better and ENT does a little worse. But then when we use the RVU method, which is really the same thing, the only difference is we're using total RVUs. Remember, it's total RVUs. We're using total RVUs to allocate. And under this choice of driver, audiology does worse and ENT does better. So if for some reason you're the audiologist and you get paid a bonus if you have a more profitable year, you're obviously going to prefer cost to revenue ratio. But if you are the ENT and you're getting a bonus based on profit, then you're going to prefer the RVU method. All right, so those are three approaches using our very basic 4-step method to allocate overhead from within a department that might have two activities, right? So in this case, we had the combined audiology and ENT clinics under one, say hearing specialty or hearing service line. And then within that, they had some amount of overhead, 300,000, that might have consisted of overhead that was incurred in the combined department. So maybe they have a shared front desk, maybe they have a shared head nurse, maybe they have a shared administrator, right? And that adds up to 300,000 that then has to be allocated across the two clinics. But that 300,000 could also include, say, housekeeping that's coming not from the combined office, but from something above the combined office, right? From the from the facilities division that supports all of the departments in the organization, which is what we talked about in chapter 6. All right, so those are a couple of methods there. Now, if we, hold Okay, so using the wonders of stop action here, since I'm recording for you, I took a minute to write down and summarize the direct cost and the overhead allocations using each of the methods for each of the clinics. So under the cost to charge ratio, the direct cost allocated to audiology or incurred by audiology was 242. The overhead was 100, so they had a total cost of 342. Under cost to revenue, we allocated them 92,308, which was a total, gives them a total of 334. So this is audiology's preferred, method because it gives them the lowest cost. And then RVU method, they get allocated 107, which brings them up to 349, which is the most expensive version of the allocation for them, right? So we have 342, 334, and 349. They have 5,000 visits, right? So if we want to calculate the cost per visit, we simply take each of these numbers, and divide them by 5,000, right? This is not super high level math. So 342, 500 divided by 5,000 gives us 6850. 334, 808 divided by 5,000 gives us 6696. And then 349, 643 divided by 5,000 gives us 6993 approximately. So this would be the full cost of providing, the average full cost of providing an audiology visit. So if we were pricing an audiology visit, in order to break even without any profit, we would have to charge at least $68.50, $66.96, or $69.93, depending on which of these allocation, cost drivers we chose to do our allocation, right? So we would want to choose the one that we think is most accurate. Now, what I said a minute ago was probably the least accurate is cost to charge, right? That's probably the least accurate because the charges are just something that's made up in the finance department. Whereas the other two are at least grounded in some reality. The RVU method is grounded in the idea that, RVUs measure how much work is involved. So if you said, well, the number of RVUs that are generated by the clinic is a good indicator of how much overhead they're using, then you'd want to use RVUs. But if you thought revenues were a better metric for measuring how much effort or how much overhead they were generating, then you might say, well, we'd use revenues. Probably wouldn't use charges because, again, they're the least accurate. So we could do the same thing down here. Again, conveniently, we had only 5,000 visits, so 585 divided by 5 gives us $117 per visit. I dropped the 3 zeros. And then 692 divided by 5,000 gives us 138.54. And then 677, 857 divided by 5,000 gives us 135.57. This might not be right. 585 divided by 5,000, 117. Yeah, that's right. Okay. Just wanted to verify. Seemed like a big jump. That's why it's a big jump. This should have been 200,000. That's why it's messed up. There we go. Because under the cost to charge, it was 100 here, 200 here. So it's actually 685, not 585. That's why it's a big number off. There you go. 685 divided by 5,000 gives me 137, right? All right, now I had a feeling that was wrong. Okay. And if I had more vanity, I'd go back and delete that part where I made a mistake, but I don't have that much vanity. So here you see, again, the same pattern plays out, except they really like the RVU method, right, which gives the audiology the worst situation, but gives them the best. And audiology likes the cost to revenue version because that gives them the least charges, and these guys the most charges, right? So if you ever have to do this for real, and you're working with two different departments or two different clinics or whatever, you know, if their bonuses are based on your decision as to which driver you're using, they're going to definitely be wanting to know why you picked one over the other. All right, so that's that portion. Now we're going to move on to a little more complicated of a story. And this is called activity-based costing, or ABC. So activity-based costing, or ABC. So like we've been talking about throughout this course, there's a cost to everything. And so ABC is probably more accurate than any of the ratio methods we just used. But it is also a lot more work. And so ABC is based on the idea that all costs are associated with some sort of activity. So all costs are associated with some activity, right? And so we try to identify the cost of each component of the activity. So we try to tie a cost to a component of the activity, or component activity. So let's start working on an example. This one has a lot of moving parts to it. And you know what? I think because I don't have the space, I'm going to go ahead and do this in Excel. So I'm going to pause. All right. Just because my handwriting is messy, and when I'm working on camera here, I usually write pretty big. I'm going to run out of space because I'm going to need too many columns. So I'm going to just do this in Excel. I'm not really going to use anything special about Excel. I'm just going to do it here because it looks a little neater. See if I can make it a little bit bigger. So we're going to have an activity. So our process is going to be getting care at say a primary care facility. So the process of getting care is going to be broken down into a series of steps or activities. And those activities are going to include check-in, getting assessed, so assessment, getting a diagnosis, getting treated, getting a prescription, checking out, and then billing. And then we'll total that up. So these are the steps in our process of getting care in our, say, our primary care facility. So it's a total of 8 steps. First thing that happens is you check in, you get assessed, diagnosed, treated, you get a prescription, maybe you check out, and then there's a bill sent to you. But from the provider side, this is the work that's being done. So actually, sorry, 7 steps. The total doesn't count as a step. So 7 steps. Let me blow this up some more. All right, hopefully that looks good on your screen. All right, so the activity. So we identify the activities, then we try to figure out what the annual cost of each of these activities is. And so we're estimating that we spend $50,000 per year on check-in. That would be pretty easy to estimate because you could, basically just take the salaries of your PSRs. Then you're going to estimate, all right, spend about $75,000 on assessments, $250,000 on diagnosis, $450,000 on treatment, $2,500 on writing prescriptions or processing prescriptions, $50,000 on checking out, and then $150,000 on billing. And so our total is 1027. Sorry, this is our this is our combined audiology and ENT clinic. Sorry, I'm getting ahead of my own game here. So this is not a primary care facility. We're still actually working in the world of our previous example, our combined audiology and ENT clinic. We're just now going to use ABC to allocate the 1.27 million in costs. So a cost driver in this case, right? So now we have our 4-step method. Step 1, cost pool, right? Step 2, cost driver. Step 3, well, we'll get to step 3 in a minute. So what is our cost driver going to be? Well, in this case, it's going to be visits. For check-in, it's going to be visits. For assessment, we're going to measure our driver in minutes, and I'll get to the actual quantities in a minute. Assessment, diagnosis, and treatment are all going to be minutes. Prescription is going to be number of prescriptions ordered, so I'm going to abbreviate that scripts, number of scripts. Checkout, like check-in, is driven by the number of visits, and billing is number of bills per visit. All right. So now we're going to continue kind of working with the cost driver component. Let me see if I can just align these. I don't know if that looks better or not. So we need to say, all right, for the specific clinics now, we have audiology, and audiology has 5,000 visits. And then on average, it takes 5 minutes per visit to do an assessment, 10 minutes per visit to do a diagnosis, 10 minutes per visit to do treatment. Half of the visits get a prescription, and then there are 5,000 visits, and then there's an average 1 bill per visit. With ENT, it's again 5,000 visits, but now you're talking about visiting a surgeon. So the assessment takes longer. It's a little more dangerous. It takes 15 minutes. The diagnosis is probably more severe, so you take 15 minutes. The treatment takes longer, so it's 20 minutes. The average number of prescriptions is 2 as opposed to half. And how would you have a half a prescription? Well, on average, if every other person gets a prescription, then you'd have, when you average it out, you'd have a half a prescription. And then checkout, because you had 5,000 check-ins, you have 5,000 checkouts, unless this is the Hotel California, in which case you can check in, but you can't check out. And then on average, there are 2 bills or maybe two procedures billed for. Okay, so we have now kind of the driver and how it's being measured. So what we need to do is total up the drive, right? Because step 1, cost pool. It's not cost poo, that's cost pool, right? There we go. Step 1 is the cost pool. Step 2 is the driver, right? But what do we use when we calculate the driver? Well, we use not the individual driver for each of the activities that are having overhead allocated to. We use the total. So the total column here. So how many total visits do we have, right? Because the driver is in terms of visits. Well, how many total visits do we have? Well, we have 5,000 plus 5,000, 10,000 visits, right? This is not, rocket science here. But where it gets a little trickier now is we have, we do assessments, and the assessments are 5 minutes per visit for audiology and 10 minutes per visit for ENT. So how many annual minutes does the audiology clinic spend on assessment? Well, it spends 5 times 5,000 would be 25,000 minutes of assessments, right? I'm taking the number of minutes per visit times the number of visits. So 5 times 5,000 is 25,000. So I'm going to do that over here. I'm going to take 5 times 5,000. And then to get the total, I need to do the same thing for ENT. So ENT has 10 minutes per visit times 5,000 visits. So 10 times 5,000 is 50,000. So when I add this up, I'm going to wind up with 5 times 5,000 is 25,000 plus 10 times 5,000 is 50,000. So 25 plus 50, 75,000. What happened there? Oh, I did a plus instead of a multiply. That's what happened. There we go, 75,000. Okay, so next is also in minutes. So it's the same procedure. I'm going to take 10 minutes per visit for diagnostics times 5,000 visits. So I'm taking 10 minutes times 5,000. It's going to give me 50,000 plus 15 minutes per visit times 5,000. So 15 times 5 is 75 plus 50. So 50 plus 75 is 125. Voila, right? Okay, so same thing again, right? We're measuring it in minutes per visit. I didn't write 10 minutes per visit in here because then I wouldn't be able to take and multiply the blocks. You might want to actually do that, say, on an exam when you're doing this, on paper. Okay, so we take 10 times 5,000. Sorry, I need to put that in parentheses. Plus 20 times 5,000. Again, forgetting my parentheses. It actually should work because order operations would make it work, but I'm going to put parentheses in there just to make it really obvious. So 10 times 5,000, that's 50,000. 20 times 5,000, that's 100,000. We're going to have 150,000 here. Okay. So those are the ones that were per minute. Now we have half a script per visit. So the total number of scripts done by audiology is going to be 0.5 times 5,000. So that'd be 2,500. And then ENT gets 2 prescriptions per visit. So 2 times 5,000 is 10,000. So our total is going to be 12,500, right? So we're going to take 0.5 times 5,000 plus 2 times 5,000, and we get 12,500. I let the order of operations just work this time. All right. So those are the hard ones. Now we're back to visits again, right? So it's expressed in visits, so we don't have to do anything. We just add this up. So we can do 5,000 plus 5,000, 10,000 visits. But now we're getting number of bills per visit. All right, so that is going to be 1 times 5,000 plus 2 bills per visit times 5,000 gives us 15,000, right? We had 1 bill per visit, so 1 times 5,000 is 5,000. And then 2 times 5,000 is 10,000. So 5,000 plus 10,000 gives us 15,000. So now we have our total driver, right? because what we're going to do next is we're going to calculate our allocation rate. Our allocation rate is going to be our cost pool divided by our allocation, by our driver. So in this case, 5, right? So it's going to cost $5 per visit. For check-in. How much is it going to cost per minute for assessment? Well, it's going to be 75,000. 75,000 in cost divided by 75,000 minutes. So it's going to be $1 per minute. $250,000 in cost, right? We're doing cost pool divided by cost driver. So cost pool 250 divided by 125, that's going to be 2, right? 450,000 in cost pool for treatment divided by 150,000 cost driver. It's going to give us $3 per minute. And then prescriptions is 2,500 divided by 12,500, which I can't do in my head. 20%. There you go, 0.2. And then checkout is $50,000 divided by 10,000. That's going to be $5 per visit. And then we have $150,000 in billing costs divided by 15,000 bills, going to give us $10 per bill. So let's remember, and it would be useful for you to actually write these down, but again, I'm not going to write down the labels. $5 per visit, $1 per minute of assessment, $2 per minute of diagnosis, $3 per minute of treatment, 20 cents per prescription, $5 per checkout, $10 per bill, right? So now we want to calculate how much does it cost to provide an audiology visit. Well, how many check-ins do you have per visit? You have 1 check-in. So you have 1 times 5, or 5. How many minutes of assessment do you get if you go to audiology? Well, you get 5 minutes of assessment per visit times $1 per minute of assessment gives us $5. All right. How about diagnosis? Well, if you go to audiology, you get 10 minutes of diagnosis times $2 per minute gives you $20 in diagnostic costs. You get 10 minutes of treatment times $3 per minute for treatment gives you $30. Prescription, you get a half a prescription on average at an average cost of 20 cents per prescription, gives you 10 cents. You check out once. So you could say, well, I put the 1 times 5 up above just to be clear about it, but clearly it's just 5, right? Because you're checking out just 1 time. So there's some logic you have to actually apply. ABC is complicated because you have to think about these things, right? And then there's 1 bill per visit. So 1 bill per visit times $10 per bill gives us $10. So the total cost of an audiology visit is $75. I'm going to go ahead and show you the decimal. So it's actually 75.10. All right. I challenge you now to pause the video and do the same estimations for an ENT visit. So in class, I'd be like, all right, now you guys take a minute to try to figure out ENT. So, all right, you guys take a minute to figure out ENT. So go ahead and pause. I'm waiting. Did you pause? All right, let's go. So if you paused, good for you. If you didn't, well, you know, not sure what to tell you there. So let's do ENT. All right, ENT is going to be check-in is $5 per visit. We're doing one visit, so the rate is 5, right? Assessment is going to be for ENT is going to be 10 minutes times a rate of $1 per minute. Treatment is 15 minutes of treatment times $2 per minute, $30. 20 minutes, oh, what did I misread? Sorry, diagnosis, that was diagnosis. Now we're doing treatment. 20 minutes of treatment times $3 per minute, $60 for treatment. So sorry, I said, when I was working on diagnosis, I said treatment. So for treatment, it is 15 minutes times $2. Right? I said I did the right numbers. I just didn't say the right thing. All right. So then prescriptions. Well, prescriptions, we get an average of 2 prescriptions per visit times a rate of 20 cents per prescription, 40 cents. We check out. Well, we only check out once. We check in and we check out one time. So $5. And then billing. We get 2 bills per visit times an allocation rate of $10 per bill, $20. So then we add up our column and we get 130. And let me just add the decimals because we're missing 130.40. Now on an exam, I would in fact like to see the change, especially if we're working with numbers where there is some change. So, you know, would I take off points if you wrote 75 instead of 75.10? I don't know. It depends on whether I had my coffee yet or not. But you know, you should show them if they're there, right? For this smaller number. If we're dealing with like millions of dollars, the pennies don't matter. Okay. So that's how you use. That's how you use. ABC. Now, one way we can check this is we can say, all right, if the full cost, not including profit, the full cost of providing an audiology visit is $75.10, what is the full cost of providing audiology services? Well, we would take $75.10 times 5,000 visits, and we get $375,500. I don't really need the pennies here. And then what is the full cost of providing ENT? Well, it would be 130, right, times 5,000. And if we add those two together, we get 1,027,500, which, look at here, 1,027,500. So that's kind of our check on whether we did the numbers correctly, the allocation correctly or not. All right. So that I think is enough for what we would have covered on Thursday. Come Tuesday, we will wrap up chapter 7. So enjoy your weekend.